Hello again, Year 6, Miss Owen here for your second topic session. So we're going to be carrying on with our ancient Egyptian topic, and we're going to be looking at Egypt chronology. So hopefully some of you might recognise that word, chronology, when we've looked at it before, and essentially it means we're going to be looking at time order. We're going to be looking at the timeline of ancient Egypt, but also looking at how the ancient Egyptian civilization fits into the world's timeline, what was going on in the world at the same time as the ancient Egyptians, but also look at all the different periods of time that have come after the ancient Egyptians, because they were around a long time ago. All right, so what you might want to do now is pause the video, write in today's date and title, which obviously you can see is a history session. And I'm just going to go through the different wills for you. So we're going to be, some of us are going to be ordering key events of ancient Egyptian times. Some of us are going to be looking at ordering key events from across history, and some of us are going to be looking at using scales to show the distance in time and show what's happened over a long period of time, which is actually quite tricky. Hopefully those of you that want to have a go at goals will accept the challenge. So what I'm going to do now is go through some really key vocabulary for you. Now, some of these words might seem really familiar, you might understand definitions of them, but some of them are new to you and linked really closely to history. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to go through all the different kind of vocabulary, and what I suggest that you do is write down any words that you are not familiar with the definitions. I'm assuming but the ones that you're really going to need to write down are dynasties and kingdoms. The rest, I think you would really you would understand once you've read them. Maybe interval and duration might be quite something that you're not used to. But any words that you haven't come across before, I write them down along with the definitions, because we could be using them again later on in our topic. It might be really useful for you to have them so you can recall what they mean. Okay, so dynasties. Get rid of that. So dynasties, where people had power and passed on leadership, so the pharaohs, to the next generations. A bit like our royal family, basically. It's a dynasty. When the old king or queen dies, the rule or the power, the leadership role, is passed on to the next generation, their firstborn child. So the dynasties in ancient Egyptians are basically the royal families, the pharaohs, and how they passed on their power to their descendants, essentially. And then we've got kingdoms, which historians use three main kingdoms to define ancient Egyptian. You've got the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Now, kingdoms, a lot of us would think are linked to different areas of Egypt, and that's not the case. This is how historians break up the ancient Egyptian timeline, essentially, because the ancient Egyptians span over thousands of years. So Egyptians have sort of cut down segments of time into this old, middle, and new kingdoms to just sort of understand when certain events happened within those thousands of years. And then we've got scaling, which is the mathematical representation of time passing. So this is very key for those that you're going to be doing gold, and basically a scale is when you divide up a segment of time into certain chunks, and those chunks are related to how much time is passing. So it might be that each chunk is worth 200 years or 2,000 years, depending on how long the segment of time is that you're looking at studying. And then we've got sequencing, something you might be quite familiar with anyway. It's arranging events into chronological order, so arranging those events into time order, which you're going to be concentrating on doing today. An interval is the period of time between events. So when you've got you've had an event happen, and then you've got a period of time when nothing happens, or nothing eventful happens, I should say, and then you've got another event. And then duration is the length of time an event or civilization existed. Okay, so when we're looking at the ancient Egyptian civilization, we're thinking about the duration. How long was this civilization actually around, and what did they accomplish? Because I think it's really important to understand. Yes, we're studying the ancient Egyptians, but we're concentrating on what they accomplished. And you'll notice later on in the session actually how evolved the ancient Egyptian civilization was compared to the rest of the world at that time. Okay, so we're going to time travel back in time now, and we're going to have a look at the key events in history from around the world. All right, I would suggest that you make some notes maybe in the back of your book, as we go, and this is very heavily linked to silver. So if you're one of those children that are maybe going to be looking at silver, you really do need to pay attention now, because what we're going to do is we're going to look at key events or key periods of time throughout history as we make our way back to the ancient Egyptians. Okay, so first stop is, so you might as well say it's 2021 now. Our first stop on our time machine is the year 1939, and it's the start of World War II. A massive point in history for a lot of countries. So that was 1939, and that's the useful information that you're going to need, because some of you are going to be plotting this onto a timeline. So you also need to know the days, or the dates, I should say, of when things happen. So 1939 is the start of World War II. I'm going to do another time jump, which takes us back in time to 1837. So remember, we're going back in time, not forward in time. And this is when the Victorians lived. So we've got Queen Victoria. If you see there in the top right hand under the stop sign, that is a Victorian school. And there is also just a selection of games that the children might have played and that kind of thing. So it was around 1837. That's when the Victorians were around, and it was quite a prosperous time for our country. It was around the time of the Industrial Revolution. The steam train was around then, so people transport around the country became a lot easier, all that kind of stuff. And then we've done another time stop to the year 1485, and that is the furthest we have travelled so far. Okay, and this is when the Tudors lived. So Henry VIII with his 6 wives. I wonder if any of you can remember the little rhyme. This is when we had an influx of different kinds of styles of housing. You can see there's a Tudor house there. A selection of Tudor houses in the street. That was very popular within the London and big cities. And then obviously in the countryside we had lots of farming going on and things like that. And it was quite a peaceful, prosperous time again for the Tudors, but a lot of things was going on in the background, obviously with Henry VIII trying to divorce his wives and behead them and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's our another time jump. So that was 1485 for the Tudors. And then we've done another time stop. This is the year of 800 AD. Furthest we've gone again. It's the time when the Vikings lived. And actually, this is one of my favourite points of history to learn about the Vikings, because they were actually very ahead of their time with their boat making skills, the fact that they wanted to go out and travel the world and find new places. Obviously, there was lots of raiding going on, and they sort of took places by force a lot of the time, but they were very clever engineers, building weapons and things like that. And then we've got another time stop. So the year is 4 BC. And Jesus essentially has just been born in Bethlehem. So this is when historians can sort of try and place when Jesus was born. So that's 4 BC. And I think it's a lot of important work to be doing, and we still have another 3,000 years to go before we reach the ancient Egyptians. 3,000 years is a huge chunk of time. And then we've got the year 31 BC, and it is the time when the Romans lived. So the ancient Egyptians actually came before the peak of the Roman Empire, if you want to say. So this is when Romans sort of came to their own with their Roman baths, their skills in making weapons and skills in making pottery and things like that. I know the Greeks were very good at that as well. Romans really enjoyed entertainment. They love to be entertained, they love to have luxurious food and things like that, but also you had to be quite wealthy to enjoy those things. It should say here, it says here, they were such a diverse, resourceful, pioneering, extraordinary people. Considering that this was 31 BC, before even Jesus Christ was born, before the Vikings, before the Victorians, we had a really sort of skillful and intelligent civilization living. And then we've got the year is 1100 BC, and we are visiting the ancient Greeks. Again, a very, very forward-thinking civilization. And this is the start of the Olympics. So this is where they came about with the Olympics. And considering we're still doing it now, it's obviously a very, very clever invention. Ooh. Sorry about the noise there, I don't know what that was on. And then this is sort of our final stop. So it's the year 3100 BC. The location is ancient Egypt. And the main things to look out for are things like the pyramids, the pharaohs, the Sphinx, the mummies, and the Nile. The pyramids are still, to this day, one of the most pioneering engineering buildings that have ever existed on planet Earth. People are still trying to figure out exactly how they managed to do it. They obviously have an idea from the tools that have been found during excavations and things like that. But considering this was done thousands of years ago, the fact that they were able to pick up huge chunks of stone and create these buildings is quite impressive. Okay, so that is our time jumps. All right then, so mini quiz. Which came first, the Victorians or the Romans? Remember which came first, not so much what has happened to us most recently, but what came first. Hopefully you've recognised that the Romans came first. When did the Vikings live? 800 AD. When was Jesus born? 4 BC. And when did the ancient Egyptians live? Roughly 3100 BC. I've remembered that all off the top of my head. That's quite good, isn't it? Okay, so now that we've looked at where in history the ancient Egyptians fall, because it's really important to understand actually when we're thinking about the chronology of the world and the world history, how far back the ancient Egyptians are. We can now look more closely at the Egyptian timeline and compare that to what was happening in Britain at relatively the same time, because obviously we don't live in Egypt, we live in Britain. So I think it's interesting for us to actually understand what was going on where we live roughly around about the same time as the ancient Egyptian civilization was living. So the duration, one of those key words, of the ancient Egyptian civilization spans approximately 3,500 years. So the ancient Egyptian civilization took up over 3,500 years of history. And within that, each kingdom, one of those key words again, holds key events or achievements. It's important to understand that the ancient Egyptians didn't just all create the pyramids, the Sphinx, or these amazing cities in 100 years or so. It spans out so much time. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a brief outline of the Egyptian timeline. You're obviously going to go into a little bit more detail. So this is the Egyptian timeline broken down into its dynasties and its kingdoms. Okay, so do you remember we were looking at that key vocabulary earlier in the session? So if I just go through a couple of things for you. This bit here, this is our scale. All right, we were talking about that, weren't we? Thinking about how we could break down time into certain chunks. And this one is going up into, or going back, I should say, in 200-year installments. I also think it's really important as well to note that you can change the amount that this scale shows. So it could go up in 500-year slots if you wanted it to. It just depends on what kind of timeline you're trying to create. But actually, for the ancient Egyptian timeline, the scale of 200 years is quite good because it shows you then really when key events could be happening, and it's also easier to see where the kingdoms are. Now there's lots of different types of kingdoms on here that we don't need to be going into. The ones that you need to recognize are the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And you can see there's huge spanses of time for each, and when certain things happened. And then along here we've got dynasties. So this is obviously Cleopatra, this is King Tutankhamun, and then right back here is actually when the Egyptians started creating the pyramids. It kind of gives you a visual representation of the ancient Egyptian timeline, and exactly, or not exactly, but to see actually how much time there was in between certain events. It didn't all just happen in one go. Happened over a long period of time. So between the completion of the Great Pyramids, so here between the Great Pyramids and the reign of Tutankhamun, there is an interval of over 1,200 years of history. So in between here is 1,200 years of history. And it's interesting to see that the actual pyramids came first before we had our sort of historical figures such as Tutankhamun and Cleopatra. And then between King Tut and Cleopatra, there is a further interval of 1,300 years of history. So there would have been many, many pharaohs in between King Tutankhamun and Cleopatra, and subsequently she was one of the last pharaohs before the ancient Egyptian civilization sort of weaned itself away and the Romans sort of took over. And a really interesting fact, they are as far apart, so King Tut and Cleopatra are as far apart as today and the Viking reigns on England. So if you think about the Vikings were around about 800 AD, that's how far apart these are, which is quite a lot of time of history. So this is kind of the sort of timeline that those of you that are doing gold are going to create, and I will show you an example of it in a second. All right, but like I said, it's a really good visual representation of the ancient Egyptian civilization and when certain things happened, because like I said, it was a real big span of time in between each events. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the tasks now. So bronze, you're going to order key events from Egyptian times and take the events of the Egyptians and place them on a timeline from oldest to newest. So I'm going to go through each activity step by step. So bronze, this is what you are going to use as your task. So these are all significant events that happened in the ancient Egyptians. These are all mixed up. Okay, so you need to obviously put them in order from oldest to newest. Okay, so the oldest one is obviously going to be before Christ. All of them are before Christ, but the oldest one is going to be the largest number. All right, and it goes down to the smallest number. So this one here, the 7,500 BC, is going to be your first element on your timeline, and then you would work your way down. And I'm just going to show you an example of yours. So I drew, I had a go at doing these just so I could show you an example of each one. So this is the bronze task. I turned my book landscape, and here I just sort of started at 7,600 BC just as an element to start with, and then I've got 0 AD. So this is when Anno Domini. This is just after Jesus was born and things like that. So, and then I've started putting on roughly whereabouts certain things happened, and you can see that I'm using the scale. I am trying to use a bit of a scale here to roughly sort of think, right, okay, well 7,500, 3,200, that's quite a big span of time. So I sort of left quite a bit of space in between those, but I was using this here and plotting these points onto my timeline. Okay, so that's bronze. Silver, you're going to order key events from across history and take the events from across history and place them into chronological order on a timeline. So you're going to use those key events that we looked at in the PowerPoint, these ones here. So you've got the ancient Egyptians, the Vikings, World War II, and you're going to plot those on a timeline in chronological order. Again, I did an example of this. So here we go. So I put in 2021, where we are now, and 3,200 BC, because we know that when we looked at the PowerPoint, it had 3,100 BC for the time of the ancient Egyptians. And then I just started plotting them on to the onto the timeline. And as an added little challenge, I put in how many years had passed between each of those events. Just to keep the brain ticking over, and to actually, in a sense, it kind of creates a bit of a scale for you, so you can see actually how much time is passing in these key events. All right, so you're going to use these and create your timeline. So that was silver. And then for gold, you're going to place events in order using a scale to show the distance in time. So you're essentially going to be creating your own dynasty timeline, like I just showed you before, with the correct scale and events that happened in both the Egyptian and Britain during this time. Okay, so I'm just going to show you the models now. All right, so not only are you going to be thinking about what happened in ancient Egyptian during that time period, you're going to be thinking about what was actually happening in Britain at that roughly around about the same time. And in Britain, it was the Bronze Age. So that's what that kind of time existed in Britain then. So if we were back in school, I would have shown you this example, but I'm going to show you one that I drew out. All right, so I used that dynasty timeline that we looked at before. I used the same scale, so going up in 200-year chunks. and I put in the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, roughly around about what time period they were. And then I've used the same scale down here for the Britain one as well. Okay, so you're essentially going to be creating two different timelines. All right, and I'm going to show you an image of one now that I created. Okay. So here we go. This is the one I started off. Now my paper was slightly smaller than your books are. So you're going to need, can you see how I've given sort of 2 lines to each time chunk just to give myself enough room? You're going to need to measure out 18 lines worth. Okay, and then you need 18 sections, so you need 36 lines essentially to give yourself enough room. But if you look at mine quite closely, you should be able to work that out. Okay, so draw a line that's 36 lines long, and then divide that down into 2 line segments. And then that will give you a really accurate scale that you could copy for the Bronze Age of Britain. All right, and then I just put in the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom as well, but that's completely up to you. You can put that in if you want to. And then what I did is I used the same time chunks for the ancient Egyptians that the bronze are using, so these ones here, and I used these ones here, which is about the Bronze Age, and I just plotted on a couple key events for each onto the different timelines. So if I look here, 3200 BC, that's roughly when hieroglyphics were started to be used. Okay, this one here, 2640 BC, was the first pyramid. So this top one is all about what happened for the ancient Egyptians. This one here is for you to use and put key events on for the Bronze Age. All right, so I'll just show you those segments again. So this is ancient Egyptians. This is the Bronze Age in Britain. And then you just plot a couple key events onto each. It'd be really interesting for you to notice that here, 800 BC is the end of the Bronze Age, and yet ancient Egyptians have still got so much history or so much life left in their civilization. Okay, so I'll just show you your examples again, your tasks again. Remember, you can go back and forth through this video, check what you need to do, pause when you need to. Any questions, teacher on duty, which will be me, because obviously I'm doing these sessions, I'm available on the Year 6 teacher support chat on Teams. And again, remember, take a photo, send it to your teacher. We want to see how you're getting on. We want to see all these amazing, fantastic pieces of work that you're creating. Hopefully you've enjoyed this session. Hope you enjoyed creating your timelines, and I will see you again very shortly for another topic session. Okay, bye.